Do you struggle with intimacy and connection? Your attachment style is affecting your sex life. Have you ever wondered why some people crave closeness while others pull away? Learn how your attachment styles affect your sex life. Are you letting your past affect your present relationships and your approach to intimacy? Let's find out how and what you can do about it. Are you using sex to feel regulated? This is a major problem. Find out how your attachment style in your relationship is affecting your sexual experience.
Welcome to Life by 8, your blueprint for living the most extraordinary life. I am Rebecca Grugan, your life architect on this journey to designing your ultimate life. If you are ready to level up using values levels, understanding yourself with the energetic blueprint, our 8 pillars to human wellness framework, this is for you. You are in the right place, so let's go.
So I want to dive in and uncover how the unique attachment style shapes our approach to intimacy, pleasure, and connection. But I'm going to start with my story. I was born what I call an affair child, meaning my mother was seeing a man who was at the time engaged to somebody. And so they were having a secret affair and mum got pregnant and he sort of said, oh, I'm going to leave her for you. And so mum kept me and I'm the second eldest. So mum I've got an older sister. The desire for sex, unfaithfully, is how I was created. This may or may not seem like it's relevant, but in my story over time, it has become completely relevant and why that created part of my identity when it came to sex. And then at about the age of 4, mum had married my stepfather and had my 2 younger sisters in that marriage. And over time, we found out that he had sexually abused me and my older sister, who are not his biological children. I wasn't aware of this, or I didn't have any memory of this until I was 15, when I lost my virginity to rape. Those experiences I am so grateful for, and I'll go into them in more detail. But I want you to know that this formed a very big part of why my attachment style is avoidant and why sex in and of itself has never really had much meaning to me until now. Because you see, for many of us, sex is not just a physical experience. It's emotional, it's mental, and in the lessons I've just come back from South Africa with, it is spiritual, way more than many people realize. And often we don't connect our experiences of sex with our attachment style or how we bond with others. We don't look at that within our sexual relationships. But in truth, attachment styles play a significant role in how we experience and communicate our needs, desires, and boundaries in intimate relationships. And so whether you're secure, anxious, avoidant, or a mix of styles, this episode, the goal of it is to help you understand how your attachment influences your sex life and relationships. A quick introduction to attachment styles for those of you who may not have learnt anything about these is the concept of attachment styles originated from the work of psychologist John Bowlby, and it was later expanded on by Mary Ainsworth. And essentially, our attachment style is formed early in life. Based on our relationships with caregivers, it shapes how we perceive relationships and how we approach closeness, intimacy, and vulnerability. And there are 4 main attachment styles: secure, anxious, avoidant, and anxious-avoidant, also referred to as fearful avoidant. And each one of these has its own unique way of relating to others, especially in those intimate relationships. And so the secure attachment, people with a secure attachment style, they feel comfortable with intimacy and trust, and they're able to communicate openly and handle emotional closeness as well. And people with anxious attachment style, they often crave intimacy, but they may worry about their partner's love or commitment. They might need constant reassurance and they could fear abandonment. And those with an avoidant style tend to feel uncomfortable with too much closeness and may push partners away or keep emotions at a distance. That's me being avoidant, working towards secure. And I'll go into that in more detail shortly. And then the anxious avoidant attachment. This style is a combination of 2 elements of both anxious and avoidant, and people with this style may want closeness but also fear it, leading to mixed signals or unpredictability in relationships. And each of these attachment styles can shape how we approach intimacy and sex. And today we're going to break down how that plays out in the bedroom and beyond. The initial introduction of my experience with sex growing up meant that, I didn't understand the value of sex, nor did I have any inkling of the fact that I had a choice in it. I thought that that's how you got love from men, because I was born from that type of experience. A man wanted sex, therefore they had sex, but there was no love, right? From the male party in that instance. And then the sexual abuse as a child, then that's like, well, that's apparently sexual. And if I felt good sexually, then that was bad because what happened was bad, as an adult told me. And I know that this may be a trigger for some of you. And so please reach out or stop listening if you're not ready to be able to handle this type of information. But it's really important for me, as somebody who works with people and coaches them and mentors them in their life in different areas, that you understand how it's been for me. And so when the sexual abuse was happening between those sort of ages of 4 and 6, I remember on reflection that it felt good. And I didn't know it was wrong. How do you at that age? And when it came out and as I started hearing more about, child sex abuse is bad and the adult is in the wrong and it's not my fault, what I internalized that to mean is that I must be a bad person because I felt good when something bad was happening to me. Does that make sense? So the abuse, the sexual interactions felt good. Of course it would. But then adults around me were saying that it was bad. And so the connection I had made, or the story I was telling myself, unaware at the time, was that sex should not feel good. Because if sex feels good, you are a bad person. That's the narrative I took on from a very young age. Evidently, I know that everything happens for me now, with my understanding of NLP and mindset and how the world works. I then put myself in situations where sex would happen. And so I was in a situation where I ended up being in a room with the door locked and his friends were on the other side of the door laughing. And intercourse happened. I had sex for the first time, not wanting to. And it wasn't a violent rape. It wasn't horrendous, but it was like I wasn't really wanting to be there. And so I just laid there. And these guys were on the other side of the door laughing. And I questioned myself for years after that experience of, did I ask for it? What did I do to get myself in that situation? Maybe this is just what happens. And so from that moment, so that was about 15, till I was 17 when I got into a longer term relationship, I had sex with a lot of people. And that was because what I was craving was connection, was love. And I thought that that's how you got it. And then I met Dan when I was 17, and he was a wonderful and is a wonderful human being. And we were together for 4 years. And so I'd moved to Adelaide at the time and then moved back to Brisbane, and that's how I met him, because I worked with his brother. It was probably the most respectful relationship or man I had ever met at the time. And we were still, I was a teenager and he was only a year or so older than me. And we had 4 years of awesomeness. But that's when I started Fashion Weekly. So I started business and I sort of had this room to breathe. And as I reflect on this, as I speak into this, then what I replaced, where I got my love from, was with creating businesses. And what I wish I knew then that I know now is that sex can be beautiful and it can have intimacy and it can be wonderful. I thank Dan for his beauty in that experience of holding the space for me as I went through that, and for what he may have missed out in those years. And then we broke up because of actions I did. And then I ended up in a relationship with a guy from high school who was the cool dude. He was the cool guy from school. And I was a tomboy and I played soccer. And I was like, I must be so lucky that he wants to be with me, that the hot guy wants to be with me. And that ended up being engaged after a very short period of time, like I'm talking about weeks. And I'm not wanting to be engaged, and him cheating on me, which I was so excited about. I can remember being in the grocery store with my sister and telling her, I was so excited that he did, because it meant that I had a reason to get out. And as I broke it off, a number of situations happened that I needed to get an AVO or DVO for the behavior that was playing out. He'd broken into my house. He was wearing my pajamas. He'd send me a video. I wasn't there at the time. And he'd steal my makeup. Like it was just so weird and intense. And I remember in that relationship, at times I'd wake up at night to him masturbating over me, and I was asleep. So there's no permission piece at play in this. But just before I got into the relationship with him, I had been catching a bus to work, and this man had come up in this coat and sat next to me at the bus stop, and then just started masturbating while I sat at the bus stop, 18 years old, waiting for the bus. It was almost, I reflect and go, that's violating. At the time, I didn't really know what to do. I said something to the bus driver when I got on, because he's done his action and had walked off. And then the bus driver took me to the police station, and I had to report. And apparently this was a thing that was happening across that area at the time. And so when that relationship was over, I reflect and go, okay, my experiences, that was not healthy. And so I started to see a psychologist at the time about that. And then in all these moments where I was single, and there's not a lot of them if I add up the amount of the long-term relationships I've been in, I've had sex with over 100 men. And society will think that and you may hear that and you go, what the fuck? Well, yes, there was a lot of fucking. But it wasn't love, and it wasn't something that I'm proud of. It's funny to me because women would talk about, like, a woman who's had that amount of sex would be a slut in a lot of people's opinions and judgments and what we wake up to and what society deems it as. But a man who's had sex with 100 women, what does that make them? They celebrate it. They talk about it in the locker rooms. And I've been in those football locker rooms where your sexual bravado is celebrated. How many women can you sleep with? But it is a different ball game if a woman is doing the same. And so it's not something that I've publicly stated out loud like this. And yet what I want to speak into is how your sex life affects who you become and your relationships, and how your attachment style is impacting your sex life. And when I was in South Africa, I learned when we went through sort of the zodiacal signs and the time of place you were born and where the planets were and all of those sort of things. And we talk about seventh house, which is other. And every person that you have ever had sex with energetically will forever be in your life, which is why I want to speak into this, because that's fucking hilarious. My seventh house is very, very full. The thing is, though, if you're somebody who has experienced sexual abuse, rape happens when you're married. It happens in long-term relationships. There are these things, these experiences, energetically learning that they stay with you forever, was super profound for me in my own healing. And I'll speak into that again shortly. So there are some people who they have a secure attachment, and sex is beautiful, wonderful, and it's enjoyable for them. And so starting with secure, people with this attachment style, they're generally comfortable with emotional intimacy. And comfort often extends to that physical intimacy as well. So they are able to express their needs and their desires without any fear of judgment or rejection. It makes it easier for them to build satisfying sexual connections with their partners. And in bed, people with secure attachment often feel free to explore their desires, to communicate and connect. They're more likely to have open conversations about the things that they do enjoy and are comfortable setting those boundaries. And their partners may feel a sense of trust and safety, and that creates a satisfying and balanced sexual experience. And so if you identify as having a secure attachment style, think about how this shows up in your intimate life. And do you feel comfortable discussing your desires? Are you able to navigate both giving and receiving pleasure with ease? Because it's important to reflect, because you may be a secure attachment style, but your partner may not be. So understanding how sex and attachment styles plays out for all different ways can help those who are single when you are dating. And for those of you in long-term relationships or in relationships at all, what your partner may be and how to work together to get the intimacy and the best outcome possible for all of you. And so anxious attachment, when we talk about the anxious person, for people with this attachment style, sex can sometimes become a way to seek validation and reassurance. And so they might crave closeness and see sex as a way to feel secure in the relationship. However, they may also worry about their partner's satisfaction or approval, no matter how good or bad it felt, leading to anxiety around their performance or whether it was enough. And sometimes sex then gets used as a way for co-regulation, where for somebody in an anxious attachment style, the goal is to work towards security, is to work towards self-regulation. And so if you are in this attachment style, ask yourself, are you utilizing sex as a way to co-regulate? And so when you don't get it, what are you making that mean for you? Because sex can sometimes feel really intense and emotional for you, and it can also be a bit insecure. You may interpret it as their lack of interest, your partner's lack of interest in sex, and take it on as a sign of rejection, even if it's not. And this can create a cycle of seeking more and more closeness and reassurance, and this may sometimes overwhelm your partner. And so if you identify as having an anxious attachment style, think about what might influence your approach to sex. Are you using sex to feel more secure in your relationship? Do you find yourself needing reassurance that your partner is attracted to you? And then moving on to avoiding attachment. People with this style often feel comfortable keeping their distance in relationships. They may enjoy sex, but they may view it as a separate experience from emotional closeness. For some people in an avoidant attachment style, sex is sex. Emotional intimacy, emotional closeness is not linked to sex. And in some cases, avoidant attachment styles may avoid intimacy altogether, especially if it feels like it threatens their sense of independence. Because for people with an avoidant attachment style, the idea of vulnerability in sexual experiences can be uncomfortable. And they may struggle to express their emotional needs during intimacy. And it may keep things more physical than emotional. And this doesn't mean that they don't enjoy sex, but they may keep it on a surface level as a way to avoid getting too close. And so if this is something that you relate to as an avoidant, consider how it shows up in your intimate relationships. Do you keep sex separate from your emotional connection? Do you find it challenging to let your guard down, even with a partner that you trust? And finally, we have the fearful avoidant, the anxious avoidant. This attachment style, people here, you often experience a push-pull dynamic. So they may desire intimacy but fear vulnerability, leading to mixed signals or emotional turbulence in your relationships. This style often stems from unresolved past trauma, making intimacy both desirable and frightening at the same time. And so in sexual relationships or experiences, people with anxious avoidant attachment, they might crave closeness but struggle with feelings of distrust or fear. They might alternate between wanting intimacy and then withdrawing from it. And this can make sexual experiences feel intense and unpredictable, as they navigate the tension between connection and self-protection. And so if you resonate with the anxious avoidant style, think about how this impacts your intimate life. Do you notice a push-pull dynamic with your partner? Do you find yourself craving intimacy but feeling uneasy when it becomes available? When you're navigating these attachment styles in intimate relationships, understanding what yours is first, and then understanding your partner's, it can influence our approach to sex. And so let's talk about how to navigate these dynamics with awareness and compassion. Regardless of your attachment style, the key to a healthy sexual relationship is open communication. And this is something that I've been focused on for the last 12 months, and specifically working on the somatic experience sexually and how my body kept the score from the traumas that I've gone through, like working with a specific coach on releasing that imprint. And so I'm going to just go into that a little bit more detail. So when you may have experienced trauma, or your partner or somebody you're intimate with, what can happen is that when anything starts to lead towards sex happening and anything goes towards their genitals, their body can brace. What I mean by that is, my experience is anything that goes near me means that I tense up naturally. That can happen when I have a pap smear at the doctor's. That can happen when we have menstruation and pads. It's why I don't use tampons, because it actually hurts, because anything that goes there, even myself, my body can tense. And it means that as soon as you do that, the enjoyment, it can hurt. The enjoyment can go away. And so as I've done the work with different coaches and how I hire coaches for myself is on specific outcomes, on specific needs. So I look at expertise, I look at, who they are and what they're about. And so the coach I'm about to work with, our number one goal is that my body stops bracing when something goes there. And so it's going to be a very intense period and work that we're going to do, but I'm so ready for it. But the only way I'm ready for it is because of the work I've been doing to get to this point. And so connecting all the dots, knowing that this is the right next step for me. When that bracing happens, if you're an avoidant attachment style, for example, and you have had sexual trauma in your life, if you're bracing and you're avoiding the intimacy, you just want the sex to happen and be over and done with. Even if we're talking about masturbation, you may just want the orgasm to happen and you just want it to be over and it's done with. You get the tension release and it's done. That's not what intimacy, that's not what sex can be. And only recently going into the different types of, magic or energy that exists. We talk about black magic, we talk about sex magic. And the experience of learning more about the power of sex energy, sexual energy, and why monogamy is important, why the masculine and feminine is important. I didn't go much into yet around, tantric and kundalini and all of these sort of things that I consciously have avoided up until now. Experiences to understand the power of what sex and love and that intimacy can be for people, and how powerful it can be when you allow yourself to experience it. You realize how sex in society has had so many of us living and having the relationships that we do have. And so communication becomes really, really important, because you need to be honest with yourself, and you need to be honest with your partner about your truth. So about your needs, and sometimes you may not know what they are. And so you need to go on a journey of learning about what your needs and what your boundaries are, and the fears that you may have when it comes to sexual experiences. And if you have an anxious attachment style, it might help to find reassurance outside of the bedroom so that you don't rely solely on sex for validation. Utilizing sex to get co-regulation. If you're in an anxious-avoidant partnership, and Paul and I identify as that. So Paul is anxious attachment style working towards secure. I'm avoidant working towards secure. So communication, and this is the big rock. This is the thing that we are working on together and individually at the moment. And so if you utilize the need for sex for you to feel safe, and you're in an avoidant partnership who avoids intimacy and sex, then can you see how that push-pull can become a really big problem? And so the partner who wants intimacy and craves that validation is not getting it because they're needing more and more, because that's how they're regulating themselves. But then the avoidant is giving more and more distance, and then sex all of a sudden becomes a chore. Say you haven't had sex for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, or whatever in a relationship, especially if you've been in one for long term, then you all of a sudden you start to know, like you start to become aware of, you're like, fuck, now I've got to. And it becomes a chore. I've got to have sex because I can tell the tension is building or whatever it is. And it becomes a chore instead of the magic it gets to be, instead of the enjoyment it can be. And if you're avoidant, try practicing vulnerability in small ways to build the trust. And as somebody who's been doing that for the last sort of 12 months and Paul doing his work as well, it has become so much more beautiful. We are closer than we've ever been. We still have moments of past patterns, but allow yourself the vulnerability. And that comes with communication. So if you're somebody who's anxious avoidant, consider seeking support, because working through those past traumas, making sense of who you are, can help you feel more secure and intimate in relationships. And so I've been away recently to South Africa to do some work with a client, and in that same space we were also doing some work in a course. And one of the biggest moments that I got to have when I went all in and I did this experience was the judgments that I make of people was primarily on people who didn't take responsibility for themselves, didn't take responsibility for their actions. And then when I dive deeper into the sexual trauma and the sex side of things, I realized that my stepfather had never taken responsibility that I knew of for his actions, and had also never apologized. Not that I'd ever felt that I needed it, but when I connected all the dots, and for those of you who may or may not know, in June, I sat down with my stepfather up in Cairns for 3 hours, and we had dinner, just the two of us, for 3 hours. And it was one of the most magical, beautiful conversations I'd ever had. We got to speak about his experience in jail. We got to experience what it was like for him to not be the parent that he wanted to be, or to be able to be there for his children, and how he classed myself as his child, even though I wasn't. The not understanding why he did what he did, and going through all of that, and his vulnerability with that, and my ability to hold that space and feel safe in it, was super powerful. And see, when I was 18, I took my sisters up to see their dad, to see him, because at the time they really wanted to know their father more, and there was nobody in our family who could deal with or handle being around him, because many of us were still reeling from the impact of the sexual abuse at the time. But I was like, if my sisters need to know about their dad, then I'll take them. And so I did, because the thing is, remember, I didn't grow up with knowing who my father was at the time. So if that was important for their identity, then I would do that. And at the time, it was fine, and I was great, and I did it, and they got to see their dad, and we came back. And what I realized is that I was probably able to do that because I was dissociated, but also the fact that my entire life, I know that I've had a pattern of, I don't tend to take things on, which is why I love internal, external energy, which there is a different podcast on that if you want to learn more about that. But the point I'm getting at is, when I was in South Africa, I called him. So I called him, and he was open, and I asked him, I'm doing some work on myself, and I want to know if you ever took responsibility for the abuse, for what actually happened. And he was like, absolutely. I take complete responsibility. None of it is your fault. I said, thank you. Like, I never heard you say that. And so part of me had been taking responsibility for it, because everything happens for us, not to us, right? And so this judgment I was making of people not taking responsibility for things was because I had actually taken on at the age of 6 responsibility for something that wasn't mine to take on. And the profound healing in that process of him taking on that responsibility, so I didn't have to anymore, even 32 years later, has allowed my healing and that cycle to complete, but also realize that I don't know everything, which partly I know that. But what I mean is that it helped with the judgment side of things of people as well. Because perception is projection. If we see it in somebody else, it means it's in us. And so I got to clean up those projections. And at the same time, I got to ask him if he was sorry, and that I had never heard him say he was. And he said, "I'm sorry." And he said more words than that. But it was closure. It was closure on something that was beyond just what my experience with him. It was healing to do with how I was conceived. It was healing to do with the abuse that had happened to my mum and her father. It was a healing for all of the ways in which sex had been and influenced the person I had become. And so for those of you who may have, and the thing is that statistically, there is way too many of us who have trauma when it comes to sex, especially women. And that rabbit hole is a whole different kettle of fish, and I'm not going to go down that today, because what I want to focus on is you understanding how your attachment style was formed and how your attachment style is impacting your sex life and your relationships now. And so that was an experience I got to have last week, and it was profound and beautiful and is something that I'm still integrating. And so on that note, I want to give you a few tips for navigating attachment and intimacy. And the number one of those is self-awareness. So recognizing your attachment style, and in the comments we'll put a link to, there's a free quiz you can do to understand your attachment style. When you can recognize that and how it shows up in your relationships, then you can start to make sense of why you may be, the behaviors that you are doing and that may be and are likely happening unconsciously. You can start to bring them to your conscious awareness. And it's only once it's in your conscious awareness that you can do the healing on that. That's what shadow work is. And another strategy is to communicate openly, to be able to share your needs and boundaries with your partner. And I know that this requires a whole heap of trust. And I've been married for 14 years, and we're at the time where I completely trust Paul, but I never really knew what I needed or wanted or desired in sex, because I had made it mean that I was a bad person if I desired anything sexually. Because if you remember at the beginning of the podcast, I spoke about how it felt good when I was a little kid. The sexual abuse felt good, but then people told me the abuse was bad. Therefore, I made it mean that I'm a bad person because it felt good. So being able to communicate that with Paul has been fundamental in the healing. And the what I find exciting is what we get to do from that sexual intimacy side of things at the moment. So that's my primary focus when it comes to what is the work that I'm doing on myself at the moment. It's to do with sexual intimacy, because I understand how that's impacting all energy, how that impacts your income, how that impacts how much money you make, how you feel about yourself, your joy, the depths of the emotions that you can feel, your ability to have fun and be spontaneous is all linked to this. It is the single most magical way to get energy is through sexual energy, the higher connection to self, not just having sex and it being earthed, being grounded. It's the actual energy that you create together in a partnership. That is the magic. That is the beauty. And I'm so excited to see what that means. And as we do that process, happy to share not the actual experiences, but the lessons learned on the process. But sharing your needs and your boundaries with your partner is super important. Don't assume that they know what you're feeling, because I know from experience and in conversations I've had with many, many people is that we think we've told them, we think we've shown them, and yet most of the time it's misunderstood because we haven't actually communicated anything. Because talking about sex can be and feel really strange and weird and unsafe for a lot of people, which leads me to working on your emotional intimacy. So building emotional closeness outside of sex this helps create a stronger foundation for physical intimacy. If out of everything I share today, this point, learning how to be emotionally connected, emotionally intimate, has to come first. And it's not like foreplay, and because a lot of times foreplay is all about like making sure that lubrication happens properly. It is about intimacy, into me, seeing the other person, holding space for the other person to feel like you see them, and vice versa. That is profoundly important for physical intimacy to come next. And then please seek support if you need it. Therapy or counseling, there is sexual coaches out there. There is so many options. There are courses online. Wherever you are at, there is something that can help you, that can support you. And getting it can be incredibly helpful, especially if you are working through attachment issues and or trauma to do with this subject. And so attachment styles, they aren't set in stone. They're simply patterns that we've developed from early childhood, which is why, again, I'm so passionate about the work we do in early childhood. But those patterns that we develop, when we have self-awareness and intention, we can work towards secure in all of our relationships, not just romantic ones. And so understanding your attachment style, it's part of our energetic blueprint here at Life by 8. Understanding your attachment style, it's a step towards building deeper, more meaningful connections, both in and out of the bedroom. As you reflect on today's episode, I want you to ask yourself, how does my attachment style impact my approach to intimacy? And what steps can I take to create a healthier relationship with myself and my partners? Wrapping up today's episode, I'm so grateful for the experiences that I have had. And I'm so grateful for the fact that I understand and I'm doing this work now. And that I know that very soon I get to have and I get to choose, right? Because up until now, I never felt like I had the choice to enjoy sex. And that I have the choice now to know that feeling good in sex does not make me a bad person. I will update you on how that journey is going, but I'm super excited about what it means for me, and I'm excited to share this with you so that you can make sense of what this means for you and what is possible. So remember that understanding your attachment style isn't about labeling yourself. It's actually about empowering yourself to grow and connect in healthier, more fulfilling ways. Until next time, take care and keep learning about the beautiful complexities of true love, intimacy, and connection. Thank you for being here.